really happy about the previous two talks because I think they've set up my talk pretty well. So thank you very much, Seth and Mitchell. I think I've got a nice lead on. That is not my talk. My name is Valerie Zimmer. I'm with the State Water Resources Control Board. And I do have a talk. It might be a slightly out-of-date one. Don't read it over here because I think I recycled the first slide. And I wasn't actually sure today what my audience would be if they'd all kind of seen my stuff before. And as you can see, we've been sort of hyper-focused on the Clear Lake Hitch. Let me get my clicker. I would have added a slide on the why, right? My whole title is all about why are we interested in surface water, groundwater interaction? Stand by the podium. I'm in the way. Okay. I can do that. And I didn't actually have a slide on this, so I'm just going to tell you really quickly why. We got involved about a year and a half ago when we were informed that. How many of you know what the Clear Lake Hitch is? And how many of you don't know what it is, actually? So most of you know what it is, I think. The Clear Lake Hitch is a fish. The fish is endemic to Clear Lake. This fish spawns in creeks. It comes up every spring and it spawns and then it returns back to the lake. And the fish is in trouble. And that's all I'm really going to say about the Clear Lake Hitch because there's a whole section on Clear Lake Hitch following. So I'm going to sort of tee up what's happening. In the next session, you'll learn more about this fish. But the point is that they spawn in the creeks. And so we're really interested in what's going on in the creeks that the fish spawn. And that is the why we've gotten involved. So we have all these questions about, what's going on with not just the creek flows, but also what's going on, how does the groundwater affect this? And so the first question is, how does the water table depth affect stream flows at different locations in the Clear Lake region? How much does groundwater pumping affect the water table depth? In the past or the present time? What that means is in the past, was last season's pumping, does that have an effect if we don't have a good winter on the next spring? We don't know. What else affects groundwater levels and stream flows? We know that there are, legacy effects of gravel mining, of, incision of the creeks, that sort of thing. Like what else is going on that might be negatively impacting the stream flow? And then the last question, we're obviously interested in how do we address this, right? If we're going to do something about it, what do we do? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? And so just a real quick, telling you a little bit about how groundwater and surface waters might interact together. The streams in Clear Lake kind of do both of these things. In the spring, when the water table is really high, your streams are flowing, and as they go downstream, they're getting bigger and bigger because they're gaining water from somewhere. They might be gaining water from tributary creeks, but they might also be gaining water from the groundwater. And so think about springs, right? As you come into the spring, you get springs, and as you go downstream, the streams get bigger and bigger, and they flow into the lake. But at some point in the season, that sort of switches, and what that means is that if you go up into the hills, you'll see flowing water, especially in Kelsey Creek and Coal Creek. But when you drive into the basin, those creeks are smaller and sometimes even dry. And so this is a condition that depends on the groundwater level in this area. And this is natural, by the way. The fact that these dry up is a natural condition. And so it is more of a matter of timing, right? Are these creeks switching from gaining to losing earlier than they should be? And if they are, why are they? And that's kind of where we're concerned. We're not talking about keeping them wet all year round because that's not natural. And so here's an example of what that means. And this is Kelsey Creek, this is Big Valley. These are two gauges, a USGS gauge in the hills and then a DWR gauge down in the basin. And the colors sort of talk about where the hitch are spawning. In this case, the red is like the hitch like to use Adobe Creek. They like to use Kelsey Creek, but then they kind of get stopped here in Kelseyville. And I think we're going to talk about why that is. But anyway, there's water up here. There's sometimes not water up here. And you can see this is 2023, and this is a spring. And you have the DWR gauge, which is downstream in the red, and then the USGS gauge, which is upstream in the blue. And what you can see in the early spring, this is April, is that the red is above the blue, which means as you go downstream, there is more water. And then at some point, right around mid-May, that switches. And now at the end of the season, you have more water up in the hills than you do downstream. And eventually near the lake, it dries up. And so this is what we talk about when we're talking about gaining and losing systems. And so in most years, this is what you see. But in some years, we see something else. And droughts are obviously a concern. And, I want to draw your attention to sort of this again, this red and blue, right? This is the blue, this is the upstream gauge. In both of these years, you can see that there is more water the entire spring season than there is downstream. In other words, the stream is never gaining in 2015. And one of the things we notice about the groundwater levels is that usually in March, the groundwater is as high as it's going to be for the whole year, right? Because you just had all this rain. In most Marches, you see pretty high groundwater levels. And so in 2015, we had a moderate groundwater level. We didn't have a high groundwater level, but, it wasn't terrible. And the other interesting thing is that the lake level was 4.5 feet. And those of you who live in the basin probably understand what that means. The lake has a gauge on it from 0 to 10 feet, roughly. And at 0, the lake is like super low, right? It's when it's super dried up. And at 10 feet, we're worried about flooding right here. So, this is a moderate lake level, kind of in the middle. And this year you can see, like, even though it's losing, the stream kind of holds water all the way until about May 30th. And that's actually not bad. That's actually, maybe that's enough water for the fish, because you have hitch coming in say April and May, and they need a few weeks. But, if most of them can get back to the lake in May, then in a drought year, that seems like a win, right? I mean, that might not be great for a non-drought year, but for a drought year, that seems great. But you see a very different situation here in 2022. 2022 is really bad. You have a low groundwater level in March. The lake level was less than 1 foot. I think those of you who live in the basin can probably talk about how low the lake was, but it was really low. And what you can see down at Kelsey Creek was that the stream just wasn't really flowing at all. Like it's dry, dry, dry. Oh, there's a little rainstorm, it flows. Dry, dry, dry. Another rainstorm, it flows. It just basically wasn't flowing unless it was actually raining. And so that's not, obviously the fish can't use that, right? If we have that going on, if there's no water down by the lake in Kelsey Creek, the fish they've got nowhere to go. And even if they get in there in this storm, they don't have enough time to hatch and to get out back to the lake. And so this is a season when the spawning run would have failed. And so we're concerned about this. Obviously we're just starting this project. We just got involved a year and a half ago. So when I'm showing you these very preliminary results, this is why I have a caveat, like we're still looking at this, like what's going on. And Mitchell, do we have this was supposed to be is this a PDF or is this is supposed to be an animation? Well, okay. It's a GIF. Yeah, it should okay. It's supposed to be an animation. If it's a PDF, it's not going to work. If it's a PowerPoint, it should work. Yeah. Seems like I don't have any. Yeah, it's not it just runs without a button being pushed. Yeah. So I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. It wouldn't run on a PDF. That's why I was okay. Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, I will show you this animation at some point later. What you would see is that you would see the groundwater levels, changing over time, which is too bad. This is a pretty quick little animation I have here. These are all of Lake County's wells. There's a few more up here, but they're like what I call the highlands. And so I have a hard time interpreting that data, like what's dry and what's wet. But in this case, you can see how does the water table change seasonally. What you would see is these colors would change on this animation. You would see kind of blues in the springs and the wet season, and then it would go to red every summer. But then you can see the drought years, it's a lot more red, and in the wet years, it's a lot more blue. And so seasonally, we have high groundwater in lowest in the fall and highest in the spring. But in drought years, you might not see that recovery into the spring. And so this is one of the things that, we're trying to figure out is what's going on. And again, this is that long-term county monthly data that Mitchell was talking about. We see, they're collecting data every month, and this is fantastic. They've got a really long record. There's a whole bunch of wells. They've put a lot of those wells online, which is fantastic. So you can go and look at it. I need to talk to Mitchell about getting the rest of that data because I'd like to see all around the basin. And by the way, I want to apologize for just focusing on Big Valley. We're not just interested in Big Valley, but that is just where most of the data happen to be collected. And so that's the easiest to show, to tell a story. But here's what we see. The problem is that we don't see everything. Big Valley EPA, that's Big Valley Rancheria, Sarah Ryan and her staff, we're able to install some continuous monitoring devices. This is, I think, every hour. And so these devices are out there collecting samples every hour. I believe this well is actually, is a well that somebody's using. But you can see there are these kind of interesting groundwater drops, and we're not seeing this in the monthly data. I don't know if this is happening all over the basin or if this is just a weird spot. I don't know if this water that's being taken is the reason you see the slope that's descending, or if that's natural. These are open questions, right? This is what we're trying to figure out. Like, is something that's going on here causing it to dry up later? I don't know. Or is this just a weird spot? And so we would like to see more of these continuous well fluctuations, because there's stuff going on that we're not seeing in the monthly data, even though the monthly data is fantastic and has a really long record and we love it. And so, how are we answering these questions? We're doing some data collection and background research. We're doing some ongoing monitoring. We're doing some analysis and model building. And we did an emergency regulation and information order that I think some of you probably are aware of. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Really quick, geology. I'm so glad we had a geology talk. Again, this is Big Valley. You can see you've got these alluvial sediments. But what you really have here, too, are these volcanic rocks. And that there was a question about the volcanic rocks, which go all the way up to the Red Hills. And the thing about volcanics, and hopefully Seth can correct me if I'm wrong, but volcanics are weird in terms of, when we think about groundwater basins in California, we tend to think about alluvial basins, which means like sand, gravel, things that sort of came down were carried by streams and look a lot like what you have in Big Valley. And that's kind of how SGMA works. SGMA is entirely focused on these alluvial basins. But there are bedrock aquifers, and the good ones tend to be in sort of volcanics. And I don't know if these are the sorts of volcanics that would make a good bedrock aquifer, but I think that's a really good question that was asked at the end of the last section about, like, what is going on with that bedrock aquifer, and is there some effect? I don't know. And so we're interested in that. But you can also see, like, especially here, this is a cross section. You see Kelsey Creek, and then you can see Adobe Creek. And one thing to note is, like, they're not really connected through the same layers. Like, they're not that far apart from each other, right? Here's Adobe Creek, and here's Kelsey Creek. But, like, the geology is totally different. Like, they're not connected. And so what's going on in one is not necessarily what's going on in the other. But the other thing that's also interesting is that you have this volcanics underlying, there's a fault here. And you can see the volcanics are pretty close to Kelsey Creek. And in fact, Kelsey Creek, I think, does go through some of volcanics in its headwaters. And, that might be why Kelsey Creek flows year round in the headwaters. It might be because there's volcanics. Coal Creek, which is over here, which is a lot more clearly in the volcanics, they'll have water in late summer. Adobe Creek, which is up here, does not. And I think this is because of the volcanics. So there is something going on with springs and the volcanics, and we are going to be looking into that. So that's what I say, we're background research. We're going to look into that. I would love to know more about what USGS knows about the rocks, so that we can maybe make that assessment with a little bit more science. We're doing some ongoing stream and groundwater monitoring. We're supporting the tribes. Are out there doing a lot of data collection in the creeks. It's awesome. And we're hoping to support them and put in new gauges. We did put in new gauges this year. And so we're going to be doing that going forward for the next few years. We also have some continuous well monitoring devices. If you have a well and you want it to do some water measuring, come talk to me after, because we have a bunch of devices that we just got, and I'd rather them be in someone's well than sit around gathering dust in our office. So we can offer that to that. Any of the wells that Mitchell and the county are using, we could potentially swap that out for a continuous well monitoring device and collect data. And we're not just interested in Big Valley. We're interested in anywhere that's potentially has a connection to any of the creeks that the hitch are spawning in. We would also like to do some aquifer pump tests, and that will probably need more than one well. That's a big deal. And, you need a well where you're pumping it continuously for like a week, and then you have other wells nearby that you're monitoring the effects, right? And this gives you what they call aquifer properties, so that you have a better idea as to how pumping might actually affect the aquifer over the long period of time. Right now, we're making some guesses as to the properties in our models, but we'd like to have real data. And by the way, these don't have to be like new wells. These could be like old abandoned wells. Those might even be better. It might be better that you're not using them, because then they're a little quieter. And so if you have an old well in your property and you're like, yeah, I'm not using it, like, why don't you come see what it is? Maybe that's where we want to go. I don't know. And then we're doing some data analysis and model building. And first of all, sorry for all the words on this slide. We are looking beyond Big Valley. And so, I did just show you a bunch of Big Valley stuff, and Big Valley is super important. But we are looking for beyond Big Valley. And I get this question like, well, why are you guys doing models? Like, we already have a model in Big Valley. We already, the GSA did a model, and USGS is doing another model if you were here yesterday. And I think the answer to that is different models do different things. Like the Big Valley sustainability models, it's a great model, and it's looking at long-term water supply sustainability. We are focusing on spring spawning season flows. And if you have a big water supply, model, you might not care too much whether the creek has 0.1 CFS or 1 CFS. But if you're a fish, it makes a huge difference, right? Because 0.1 and 1 is effectively not flowing if you have a big model. But we're going to be focusing on these sort of like spring season flows and groundwater. That's where we're going to be looking at that. And so that's one reason. The other thing is we're going to be using all the data from the existing models, right? Like the models, all that information that was collected in those models, all the information that the tribes are collecting, that's where we're starting, right? We're starting from all this great work that's already been done, and we're going to use that great work going forward and try to sort of drill down into the questions that we really are trying to get at, which is this sort of spring spawning season flow. And all the other things. And we've hired a consultant because we can't do it ourselves. We're not modelers, and we've got a consultant called O'Connor Environmental, and I feel pretty good about this because they have a lot of experience over the hill in Sonoma County doing these surface water, groundwater models, working on ecological flow focused models. That's kind of their jam. They worked with the county on their well ordinance in Sonoma County. They worked with ag groups on, frost protection regulations. And so they have a lot of sort of ag and county and well and groundwater, surface water and ecology kind of experience. And I think that's gonna be a good partnership. However, we're not anywhere near the finished product. Like 2027 is when we're going to be done. And finally, we did do an informational order. Folks were sent letters. We tried to sort of target folks that were ag or potentially, had big properties. That a lot of those folks were domestic. And you can see that we actually did send some letters to ag out in the Red Hills area. And this is we got a lot of questions about that, right? People said, why are you going out there? It's not near the creeks. And they're not wrong about that, but we don't know what this aquifer is doing, and we want more information on that. And that was why. And folks had, they were allowed to, report on multiple parcels. We were trying to make it as easy as possible. We didn't want to like overburden folks. They had 3 options on how to comply. There was a direct straight to us through the Farm Bureau. And then we have a group of ag growers that were actually doing work before we even sent this information order out. And so we kind of let them continue doing what they were doing and collected the same kind of information from them. This is an ongoing thing, by the way. We haven't finished. There are no results. Their second report is due at the end of the month. And so this is still, data are still coming in, but we have about 1,300 parcels that reported to us, which is great. That's a lot. And maybe 470 of them look to be ag. And so, I think we've got a lot of data going forward, and I think we're gonna make good use of that. Future data collection, I kind of already talked about that. We are going to have some additional stream gauge data. Some of the ag folks are collecting stream gauge data and are going to be providing that, which is fantastic. And then again, we're looking to identify landowners for continuous well monitoring and potentially wells for aquifer pump tests. And some of this is also working with the ag growers. Like we do have some good cooperation, and I want to call that out. And then finally, if you have questions and you want to get together with us, here's some resources. You can take a picture and contact us if you have comments or questions. And I guess I'll take a few questions.